joining us for today's installment of the Spring Seminar Series, hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. Each year, we invite leading international scholars working in different aspects of Hellenic studies to present their research on a wide range of topics in the fields of archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek literature and history, as well as cultural studies. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Willoughby Mountain in the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I'd ask you to visit the SFU IT Services website, as this is a hybrid event. Online audience, please send us a message in the Q&A if you have any significant problems hearing the presentation. If for some reason the sound quality is poor and cannot be resolved, know that the event is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available at a later date for viewing. In-person audience, please ensure that you speak loudly enough when asking your question, and please be quiet during the presentation, as any audio will be picked up by our mics and recorded. Today's speaker is Elizabeth DePalma Digeser, professor of Roman history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of A Threat to Public Piety, Christians, Platonists, and the Great Persecution, and The Making of a Christian Empire, Lactantius and Rome. She is also the founding editor of Studies in Late Antiquity, now in its 6th year of publication. Where her earlier work studied the intersection of religion and philosophy with Roman political power, her current research explores processes of political, religious, and economic transformation in late ancient Gaul that were the context of the Emperor Constantine's accession. I hope you all enjoyed today's presentation from Dr. Digeser.
Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. I am delighted to be here at Simon Fraser, and it is an indescribable pleasure to be able to give a paper to an actual live audience. It's such a treat for me after the past few years. Although the few cities in Northwestern Europe have a better textual and material record for late 3rd and early 4th century than the French city of Autun, no one has ever integrated these sources to explore how and why ancient patterns of life began to give way during the pivotal period in northeastern Roman Gaul. Adapting a methodology inspired by feminist historians, I've been exploring the effect on Autun's political economy of resources funneled to the city's bishop by the Emperor Constantine, an emperor whom many people might argue founded what we might call the Byzantine expression of Roman power. My immediate goal has been to explore how Constantine's patronage might have translated into Gallic support in the early years he spent as emperor. But also, and just as important, because Constantine didn't restrict his episcopal patronage just to Autun, the city's experience serves as a case study demonstrating how imperial patronage of local bishops could not only translate into support, but could also push cities under Roman rule to a more medieval political economy. In what I'm calling a medieval political economy, for lack of a better term, these bishops became increasingly significant within their cities as landowners and as developers of what we might call a religious tourism economy, while in a separate shift driven initially by 3rd century economic uncertainty, people moved away from the cities and specialist crops in favor of mixed agriculture and the countryside. This analysis also demonstrates how socio-political relationships in one community shifted to accommodate the increasingly assertive and hierarchical power of the bishop in late antiquity. For my own work, this analysis is significant because it helps explain how Constantine consolidated his grasp on power. There's been a tendency, I think, to gloss over the first 10 years of Constantine's reign, when he was responsible for the northwest quadrant of the Roman Empire and shared power with other emperors. The sources for this period are terrible, and so that explains some of the inattention to this period. But his later successes, he ruled for 30 years all told, have allowed most historians, I think, to easily assume that he easily slipped into power after the death of his father in 306 and went through a shaky patch only when he executed his father-in-law, the former Emperor Maximian, for treason in 310. But I think this view is mistaken for a couple of reasons. First, it ignores the very dicey relationship that Constantine had with Galerius, the head of the imperial college in the East. Second, as we know all too well these days, power can be asserted, but it must be accepted to be effective. Constantine did have the support of the army, but Gaul's famous history as a breakaway province in the 3rd century meant that local elites could reach out to others for help in fomenting resistance, others as close by as Italy in the persons of Maximian, the former emperor, and his son Maxentius. In this situation of initial precarity, the exchanges that led to Constantine's tour interest me as part of a larger project. The book monograph I've titled The Once and Future King, Visions of Constantine from Late Ancient Gaul. This book, which I'm in the last, second to last stages of preparation for UC Press, this book looks at how Constantine's patronage and propaganda in 3 main areas responded to local needs. More broadly, I think the project is significant for helping us understand structural transformations that were not only related to the growth of Christianity in the empire, but also transformed the social, political, and economic foundations of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And in this way, I think the project complements recent work by Noel Lenski looking at Constantine and the cities, and Peter Brown, who has looked at the influx of private monies into the church in late antiquity. For this audience here in the Center of Hellenic Studies, I think this study is of interest because Christianity came to Gaul through the migration of Greek-speaking people early in the 2nd century, and it continued to flourish within and spread out from those communities in late antiquity. And as you can see from the map, going up the Rhone River, you find some of the very earliest communities of Christians who would have been Greek speakers as early as the 2nd century. At the same time, cities in the 4th century Greek East, as you can also see from the map, had even larger Christian populations and had suffered more serious harms during the persecutions of Diocletian, Galerius, and Maximin Daia. Now, the specific economic transformations I'm going to talk about having to do with viticulture are probably not applicable across the board, but I do think that the mechanism by which the bishop became a more important player in Autun probably is something we might want to think about for regions well outside the West. As it happens, Autun is especially suited to this kind of study. Unique among all but a handful of late ancient cities and alone among the cities of Gaul, Autun left traces of its late 3rd and early 4th century life in a series of speeches delivered by professors from its famous Academy of Law and Rhetoric, the famous Latin panegyrics. Several of these speeches delivered to and about Constantine and his father are not only great sources of local information, but they're also good evidence for local support and imperial patronage. The city has also long attracted the attention of archaeologists, and I just couldn't resist showing you this beautiful glass vessel, which has just recently been dug out of the ground at a Christian necropolis in Autun. Isn't it gorgeous? The lettering around the side says Vivas Felicite, and they just did a residue analysis and found that it has like the earliest known residue of ambergris. So it's just a very interesting thing that's come to people's attention lately. Some people have associated it with the Christian community there, and I'm not sure what the scholarship on that is right now. Nevertheless, none of these sources allows us to see directly how people's lives changed in response to changing economic circumstances. It's these granular changes, I think, that translate into popular support or the withholding of popular support. And this is why I've been experimenting with a methodology inspired by feminist historians and by subaltern studies. You know, we just used to throw up our hands, right, when texts failed to tell us what we wanted to know about women or about really any people other than the elite people in our texts. But more recently, scholars such as Amy Richland at UCLA and Saidiya Hartman, historian of enslavement in the Americas, have been talking about different methodologies we could use to get off the printed page. In Arguments with Silence, which I just find to be a very stimulating collection of essays, Richland argues, she sets out really a list of heuristics we might follow in trying to push past the limitations of texts, from using a wide range of evidence to arguing with silence. For her part, there we go. For her part, historians like Hartman, in studying the Atlantic slave trade, have used critical fabulation to overcome the limitations of documents and archives. This method works, as she says, by advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive and fashioning a narrative based on archival research. And you know, the emphasis is here, it's not that you're just imagining out of whole cloth, that you have to have, for her case, an archival foundation, in my case, an archaeological and textual foundation on which your imagination might rest. While Danielle Padilla-Peralta and Jennifer Trimble, for example, have applied methods similar to Hartman's to explore the lives of enslaved persons, I'm not aware of any study that's applied this technique, as I will do today, to explore late ancient socioeconomic systems more broadly. In this study, what I've done is to work with not just the archaeological record, and it is quite extensive for Autun. The local archaeologists there have been very, very active, and there's also been a lot of regional exploration as well. But then I've also worked with resources such as Jones's Late Roman Empire and Andy Sherwood's wonderful compendium of sources on Greek and Roman technology, to just make lists and lists of, well, what kind of people should we expect to find there? What kind of industries? What would people in these industries be doing? And just to try to populate the area, and then use my imagination to put it all in motion. And you can tell me whether or not this is successful at the end of my talk. Autun is remarkably well situated in Burgundy, in a region especially good for agriculture, viticulture in particular. By the beginning of the 3rd century, these resources led to mutually supporting industries, professions, and livelihoods. If Autun was like other Roman towns, agriculture would have been the basis of the population's wealth, as farmers and villa representatives came into the city to sell their surplus and buy what they needed from local artisans and shopkeepers. Wine and table grape production in turn likely supported nearby basket and barrel industries. In addition to the vineyard economy, there were other industries, as you can see from the slide. Autun's size and monuments testified not just to its residents' productive use of local resources, but also to how effectively the city's political and economic leaders had managed them. As a planned colonia, Autun from its origins featured many of the urban amenities that distinguished the Roman Empire's settler colonial foundations, as you can see from the map. Autun's many gifts had allowed the city to function as a nodal point within the urban system of the Western Empire. As goods moved back and forth, so did people. Autun's agricultural, commercial, and industrial economy supported a high level of immigration and emigration, linking it to regions well beyond central Gaul. For example, from at least the 2nd century, Autun's residents included many Greek speakers. The movement of people was also responsible for Autun's becoming home to one of Gaul's earliest Christian communities. Their existence often overlooked, but unsurprising, given the city's proximity to Lyon, the provincial capital, where their even earlier existence is better known thanks to Irenaeus and Eusebius. The city's amenities and connections also attracted the professors and students required to support one of the most prestigious colleges of rhetoric and law in the Northwest Empire. Lying along an important military supply line linking Lyon to Cologne through Chalon, people in Autun likely took pride in the city's place as an important node in the economic network that supported the Roman administrative and military structure, with wine, among other things. By mid-century, however, Autun had endured a string of tragedies, the serious emotional toll of which can be imagined from the devastation the city's infrastructure had endured. For example, the Ciprianic pandemic likely robbed the city and surrounding rural villages of a number of residents. Archaeological reports estimate between a 40 and 60% drop in the region's population. Although there's no documentary evidence of the disease, heavy traffic had linked Autun and Carthage, as you can see from the map, and the pandemic was well attested in Carthage, which virtually assured, I think, the pathogen's arrival in central Gaul. And I should note my own positionality in writing this paper last year during the pandemic in Santa Barbara County, which is a major wine producing region in California. So it was in some ways easy to imagine what people were enduring in this period. The city also suffered serious physical damage from Roman troops in the waning days of the Gallic Empire. As the pandemic destabilized central control, Germans and Persians raided the Rhine, Danube, and eastern frontiers. To mount a more effective advance against the Germans than the emperor seemed willing or able to do, Postumus, a part German military commander, seized control of the northern armies. The provinces of Hispania, Britannia, Gaul, and Germania followed his leadership. In the struggle over command of the Gallic Empire after Postumus's death, however, Autun allied with the Emperor Claudius II. As the archaeology reveals, although the Germanic raids of the period seem to have left Autun unscathed, Victorinus, Postumus's successor, besieged the city as punishment for supporting Claudius. Now, obviously, the archaeology itself can't tell you which army besieged the town, but in this case, we have testimony from one of the panegyrics, an oration written by Eumenius, who was a resident of the town at the time, so we can put the text together with the material culture. The siege significantly damaged the city's urban fabric and rode roughshod over the surrounding countryside, as you can see from the slide. The Vagaudi, probably ordinary people made homeless by recent upheavals, supported themselves by raiding those who continued to reside in the city and countryside. Starting with Claudius II, who himself died of the pandemic, emperors had tried to bring the Gallic Empire back under central control, but this wasn't easily established when 5 men occupied the throne between the reigns of Claudius II and Diocletian. Even though the tetrarchy would prove to be more stable, it was unable to rebuild Autun or any other city before the tetrarchic emperor Constantius, Constantine's father, put down Carausius and Electus, usurpers who had seized Britain and the Gallic port city of Boulogne. This was an especially grave situation, given the prominence of Trier as an administrative center in the early 4th century and the needs of the frontier. Shifting into the subjunctive here, the economic effects of these aggregated hardships are relatively easy to imagine. We know from the Latin panegyrics that the vineyard economy had collapsed. This situation would have undermined the economic security of everyone involved, from the landlords to their labor to their suppliers. The landlords were bringing in much less cash, and the consequences of that shift would have been manifold. The villas would have been thrown into an exchange economy, growing what they could to sustain themselves and trading whatever surplus for the things that they lacked. The landlords would likely continue to employ the men and women who maintained their kitchen gardens, whether as wage earners or enslaved persons. In the best days, the villas could support perhaps as many as 10 workers per jugerum, and we know this from Cato and Varro. But as income contracted, the villas could support far fewer laborers. And so the landlords would have had to let go a number of wage earners or people whom they had fed and housed in exchange for their labor. These would have included people who were themselves farmers, farmhands working for remuneration, or people working off debts. Neither they nor their spouses and children were likely to find work in the area, since everyone was in the same situation. Generous landlords, or those with large holdings, might have allowed them to farm a plot for a portion of the proceeds. And what we really see from the archaeology is that the bigger villas seem to have survived and the smaller ones seem to have disappeared. But one shouldn't assume that someone who used to plant, train, graft, harvest, or prune grapes could successfully take up subsistence farming for themselves and their families. And that person would still need a startup investment. Life would have become even more precarious for people enslaved to the villa owners. Landlords might try to sell them, but if the surrounding villas were in the same situation, there would be few people in a position to buy them. The landlords may thus have freed and released men and women enslaved to them if their upkeep cost more than their value. Whether free agricultural worker or freed person, few people can quickly become so proficient at farming, even if granted a plot of land and startup materials, that they could sustain themselves and their families, especially in a region that endures significant winters. Along with the collapse of the grape economy, portions at least of the industrial economy would have collapsed. Barrel making, for example, and coroplast pottery. Their diminished income would put factory owners in a difficult position with respect to their labor. Like the landlords, they would have had to let go men and women working for wages or whomever they fed and housed in exchange for labor. Like the landlords, they too would probably have freed men and women enslaved to them once their value dropped below the cost of their upkeep. If the factory owners owned no land, they, like their labor, would have been forced to try to sustain themselves and their families. They might have migrated with or without their families, leading to that drop in population, in search of other employment opportunities, or tried their hand at urban farming, or petitioned a local landlord for a plot to farm in exchange for some of the yield. Again, farming is difficult. There were no troops stationed in Autun to provide either cash or labor. And finally, Autun's depressed wine economy would have also brought down suppliers outside the city. The amphora factory in Guignon, for example, seems to have declined in this very period. Finally, Autun's school of law and rhetoric would also have been affected, and we know this as well from the panegyrics. Hazardous travel and a damaged urban core meant that the school would have had difficulty in attracting students from outside the region. Fewer students meant a reduced income. We all know this, whether paid directly to the faculty or to the city. The size of the faculty would have shrunk, either because some might have moved on with their families, or because those who died were not replaced. The school administration would have been able to support fewer men and women earning wages or enslaved to them to care for the building and its students, and so those people would have left as well. The school's building was damaged, and so the faculty taught in their homes. This also kind of strikes a chord these days. Nevertheless, the persistence of the school, like the presence of a few aristocratic homes, shows that the economy had shrunk, but the economic structure hadn't totally collapsed. The demographic, agricultural, and economic calamities together would have disrupted Autun's political and civic functioning. Since landowning was likely a qualification for membership, reduced circumstances for the villa landlords and industrial proprietors would have meant fewer people to serve as decurions on the city council, which likely numbered once in the hundreds, and as curatores civitatis, leaving administration and decisions in the hands of fewer men with fewer sons to succeed them. Thus, there were fewer men to elect or appoint as quaestors to oversee the local finances, or as aediles to maintain the streets and water supply and run the market. Moreover, there were fewer men available to appoint as tax collectors, a task which would have exacerbated civic tensions because there was also less human capital to invest in repairing or maintaining public infrastructure or to support the school. So what we see is a kind of spiraling effect of these economic difficulties, leading to what we would call today a serious economic depression. There were fewer people to appoint as priests, less agricultural surplus to sustain rituals, including festivals, sacrifice, and feasting, not to mention games or theatrical displays. Finally, all those whom the city administration supported, from professors and doctors to the humbled free or corvée labor, would have found their incomes or sustenance diminished, if not eliminated, with dire effects for their families. Taken together, these disruptions would have isolated Autun's residents. Fewer students at the school meant that the faculty had diminished networks outside the city. The reduced population and very poor state of the roads, and we also know this from textual sources, meant that fewer people would have traveled to Autun. There were fewer marketing opportunities, fewer employment opportunities, diminished audience for the theater. It would have been much more difficult for the city council to send delegations communicating the city's needs to the governor, not to mention the praetorian prefect for consistory in Trier. In short, diminished economic circumstances impeded the city's ability to serve as part of the supply chain, supporting the troops at the northeastern frontier. This was the situation in 284 when the Emperor Diocletian came to power. His creation of a new provincial structure maintained Autun's role in the northwestern quadrant, while his division of power finally created the human resources necessary for Autun to regain its earlier functionality. But imagining a new provincial structure in the empire's northwest quadrant was not the same thing as imposing it. Here we can move into a less subjunctive register. First, the Emperor Maximian had to subdue the Vagaudi, those free-ranging raiders that I mentioned earlier. Then the Emperor Constantius's defeat of Carausius and Electus, who not only helped to restore Autun's connection with northern Gaul, but it also provided resources for restoring the city. Constantius enslaved Carausius's former allies and put them to work in the fields north of Autun. Legionary engineers rebuilt Autun's aqueducts and private homes. British artisans rebuilt old houses, repaired public structures, and restored temples. Constantius also appointed Eumenius. We just met him as a witness to the devastation of Victorinus. Eumenius was a former member of the consistory, and he became director of the college, and he in turn donated his considerable salary toward restoring the College of Law and Rhetoric. The emperor also encouraged wealthy families to move to Autun, and he supplied many new students to the school. Shifting back into the subjunctive, these imperial investments would have replicated to some degree the socioeconomic structures that had characterized Autun before its decade of troubles. It's unclear what the wealthy newcomers did with their money, but there are a number of possibilities. They might have purchased villas and townhomes from bankrupt landlords, replicating the network of labor and social dependencies that the city had known before. They might have loaned money to landlords, putting themselves at the top of those agricultural networks. They might have loaned money to entrepreneurs, reviving local industries. These investments would have exerted then now a centripetal pull beyond the city, encouraging people to come and find work, whether in the fields or in the town. We already saw one example of this with Hellenic, who came from a line of Autun magistri. The men of these new families, in other words, would have become important players overnight. They were financial patrons and they were connected to the emperor. Despite the resources Constantius had lavished on the town early in the 4th century, however, by the time of his death in 306, the town's residents were aggrieved once again, but this time from imperial policies. These policies challenged the city's residents in new ways. First, in answer to the edicts of persecution that Diocletian had issued early in 303, Constantius's soldiers would have demolished the church where Autun's Christians had, since 260, legally assembled, likely a modest structure, perhaps part of the bishop's house. Throughout the bishop's community, there would have been a shockwave of anger at this attack because it was unprovoked. In this way, the situation was substantially different from the earlier execution of Symphorian, the Christian who had mutilated Autun's statue of Berecynthia during the reign of Aurelian. 3 years after the demolition of the church, the Tetrarch's new taxation system threatened to undermine the city's recent economic gains. Now landowners were assessed taxes on fallow and flooded vineyards, which were still clearly a problem for the city. Although scholars of an earlier generation saw Autun's history after Constantius as one of decline, his son's patronage allowed the city to function within the emergent late ancient social and cultural economy. First, by restoring its productivity and connectivity, and second, by infusing its Christian community with the resources that would help sustain the city throughout the turbulent 5th century and emerge on the other side as an important episcopal see. It's this investment and others like it in cities dark to us that formed the basis of his support. In 310, Constantine, Constantius's son and successor, had just presided over the execution for sedition of his father-in-law, the former Emperor Maximian. The need to address this dicey political situation on top of the broader context of precarity that I mentioned earlier motivated Constantine to address some of the harms that his father's policies had wrought. In particular, in Autun, he forgave 5 years of tax debt. He patronized a series of professors from the college, and he likely provided Autun's bishop Reticius with significant resources to rebuild his church. We don't know how much Reticius received, but the bishop of Carthage, a city of about 100,000 people, so maybe 5 times bigger than Autun, received between 125 and 300 pounds of gold. He also, Constantine also fortified the town of Tournus, where there were warehouses and which may have helped safeguard local transport. Constantine's interventions, however, would have shifted the balance of power in Autun, creating a more multipolar configuration in which he was also a player. In the first place, forgiving 5 years of taxes would have preserved the standing of the town's traditional power structure, and I'm sure that that was intentional. At the same time, the socioeconomic standing of certain professors at the school would have risen, at least for a time, as their involvement with the emperor and court had brought change to the town, enhancing Autun's reputation as a well-connected law school, attracting more students, and boosting the possibility that the imperial court might be their future employer. So you see these webs of connections starting to form between the emperor, the court, and the community. The cash stipend that the bishop received would have dramatically expanded his status and economic influence, putting him on par with other local elites. He could now purchase land and have the means to become a significant local patron with the funds from the emperor. To build a new church, the bishop would have had to amplify his clientele. There would have been an economic and social ripple effect as the bishop hired labor and paid wages for church construction. Whereas Constantius had provided labor and talent from the army, the bishop would have had to find and purchase local materials and compensate local workers. The church that resulted is probably the late ancient funerary mausoleum 1 kilometer east of the city of Saint-Pierre-l'Estrée, which monumentalized a grave in a cemetery already in Christian use. The bishop would also likely have gained future time, as he now had the funds to hire free or buy enslaved labor for work he might once have done himself. Ruticius used his leisure to write against innovation and to pen commentaries on the Song of Songs. Participating in councils at Rome and Arles, called at the emperor's behest to resolve the Donatist issue, would have raised Ruticius's standing even more. And so again, you see these sort of webs of connection forming between local people and the imperial court, a system in which the emperor is the patron and the urban population are the clients, but supporting the emperor in exchange for his munificence. Constantine also sat more firmly atop the city's various hierarchies, which was one of the major motivations, I'm sure, for his investment. His interventions not only reinvigorated the traditional pressure groups of landowners, association leaders, and professors, but they also reaffirmed the old model of the emperor as the universal patron. Although technically Autun's leaders were supposed to appeal to the emperor through the governor or further to the vicarius and praetorian prefect in Trier, the direct person-to-person contact that the professors and the bishop had made with the emperor would have well served them and their networks in the future. Evidence for the debt that the Christian community felt to the emperor's ample, extending beyond the construction of the church into the town's culture. For example, the poem Laudes Domini, usually dated to 317, but likely earlier, refers to Constantine as the poet's savior, an image that court propaganda was also cultivating. I talk about this propaganda in other chapters of the book. Moreover, the acrostic in the Pactorius inscription shows Greek-speaking Christians in Autun to have been engaged with poetic ideas circulating at Constantine's court and vice versa. What would this have meant in practical terms? Well, this is why my title is ironic. The irony, of course, is that the famous medieval donation of Constantine gave the Pope land and subordinated the emperor to the Pope, but it was fake, right? We all know that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. In this case, though, however, in the late antique case, no one knows about it, so it's not famous, but Constantine actually did give the bishop something that helped put him on top, at least for a bit. Autun would experience many more hardships over the course of the late 4th and well into the 5th century. Within the walls, the city's footprint shifted markedly, taking the shape that would define the town for the next millennium. After Constantine, a smaller castrum came into existence, which served as the locus of the city's count when the decurions gave way. By the late 4th century, workshops and a gynoecium defined Autun instead of the school, which seems to have disappeared. In the south, St. Nazarius was built by the 6th century at the latest. By the early 7th century, 2 monasteries occupied the deserted parts of the lower ancient city. The castrum, together with the ecclesiastical complex, comprised one pole of the town, with the secular authority maintaining control of the foreign region. There was also considerable development outside the walls. Burials clustered around the late ancient mausoleum at Saint-Pierre. By the mid-4th century, when a second structure appeared east of the tomb to create a funerary church. This structure in the 5th century became a 3-aisled basilica. Remodeled in the 6th and 8th century, its tombs of Autun's sainted bishops, along with the local saints, became one of the most famous pilgrimage sites of Merovingian Gaul renowned for its miracles. It was joined by monasteries dedicated to Saint Symphorian, remember our 3rd century martyr, and Saint Martin, of course, the patron saint of Gaul at the time. Symphorian's tomb, probably first housed in the church's Celula, moved to a church a bit north, built by Bishop Euphronius. As veneration of Symphorian spread throughout Gaul, making him the most popular regional saint, his tomb became a pilgrimage site along with the tombs of Autun's 4th century bishops. St. Martin's and other monasteries probably sustained themselves by participating in the villa economy, while the city's landowning elites didn't completely disappear. Their villas lay next to the monasteries whose monks joined them in making a living from the land and being linked to multiple networks of power. During the Merovingian period, as the temples to its traditional protectors fell into ruins and disappeared, Autun saw stability as an episcopal see. The city's bishop continued to be a power broker in the region, increasingly independent from the king, helped in some part by the religious tourism that he played a role in developing. For example, Bishop Syagrius baptized Clothar II, hosted Augustine and his monks on their way to reconvert people of Britain, and was granted a pallium by Pope Gregory I. My exploration of Autun's socio-political transformation in late antiquity began with a small group of people, the orators, including Numinius, who related the dire economic situation of their city and gave thanks upon its renewal. The emperors Constantius and Constantine, who reached out with economic aid, and the bishop Reticulus, whose position imperial patronage had uniquely improved. Imagining all the nameless people involved in Autun's economic difficulties and renewal, however, allowed my exploration of the city to become a case study illustrating how a seeming act of economic and social justice, compensating the bishop for the destruction of his church, had both intended and unintended consequences, boosting local support for the emperor, but also changing the power structure that directed the socioeconomic life of the city. Noah Lenski has recently argued that Constantine's court took advantage of open lines of communication with the empire's cities to press forward, when practicable, an agenda of Christianization. But this analysis suggests that simply compensating the Christian community to offset the cost of damage to their infrastructure could have helped shift the empire cities toward a more medieval economy, even in the absence of any overarching ideological goal. Constantine's successors could have changed the direction of his policies, but they largely didn't. Thus, Autun's story allows us a glimpse into the transformation of the urban landscape and economy from its ancient political and economic patterns into the start of a different way of life. It also helps explain the early success of Constantine's dynasty in a way independent of his conversion, as a ruler who took advantage of economic depression to cultivate popular support from the ground up. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. Beyond my ken in many ways, but just fascinated to see how these arguments from silence work and how you can appropriate what we know from other historical periods and authors to imagine what's going on given the circumstances that are present. So that's great. Questions?
Can I start with a comment? It is rare that an academic talk improves my mental health. And I'll explain what that means. My second monograph tried to do exactly the subjective kind of approach through biography. But inevitably there were a lot of silences. And when I was trying to explain how I approached this, I was basically saying that, look, economic historians have been doing that forever through modeling. I mean, Hopkins' species on taxes, rents, trade. But you've done this so elegantly and convincingly for a town, and I'm really interested to see what the book is going to do. So you make me feel so much more comfortable about a book that has made me happy, but also at the same time very stressed about reception and, the kind of argument. So thank you for that, because this was convincing. And one little thing on the idea of compensation, with which you almost closed as a transformative act, it almost puts a bit of a different light on Ambrose's really stark warnings to not compensate the Jews for the burning of the synagogues, for example. Because it is not just about a legal thing and about being nice to the Jews. It is about what the implications of that might be, right?
Yeah, I think that is exactly right, and it shifts our understanding of that in a number of important ways. It suggests that this analysis has some teeth to it, that people at the time understood what a difference a cash infusion might mean. You know, when Constantine compensates the villa landowners, he gives them a tax relief. That's not the same thing. They don't have to give him money, but they're not getting any kind of specie. Whereas the kind of fungible wealth that the bishop gets is really, I think, a key factor in sort of shoring up his position in the town. And that is something that rabbis would not have had, right? And so it does, I think, force us to think about other social religious dynamics in the late Roman Empire. And I think also, you know, Ambrose doesn't come off well in this, no matter how you look at him, right? But it shifts. In addition to the sort of the religious bigotry, it does give it an economic. I mean, who else but Ambrose would have a shrewd sense of the economy of being a bishop, right? So yeah, thank you for that. That's a great.
And just a follow up on this, almost kind of New Deal kind of approach to the period. I wonder whether the more intense intervention on the ground in the Tetrarchic kind of period, with the presence of multiple emperors, teaches the Tetrarchs themselves, and of course Constantine, lessons about the transformative power of Roman authority and sheer cash. And in doing so, makes possible a city like Constantinople or a city like Thessaloniki. So you start in Gaul with these kinds of experiments, and then once it works, okay, I can do it at a bigger scale.
I think that's a really provocative idea. I mean, there was also a lot to prepare. So I think, you know, if you could get into the mind of Diocletian for a moment, his insight was to realize that you need to acknowledge divided power. You could either effectively use divided power or you could fight against it. And he decided that it was useful for that particular period to do it. It did mean that they had better information, and and this is why, you know, the empire fractured in the 3rd century, because they needed people on the ground to deal with local emergencies. But then with that knowledge, then you realize that you can do new things. And also, you know, in a patron-client system like the Roman Empire, you realize that yes, you've got economic depression coming out of the 3rd century. This is an enormous opportunity, you know, for you to, if you play your cards right, to really consolidate your power. And I think that is what Constantine did, whether it was, you know, how much of this he had conceptualized at the beginning is anybody's guess, but if you need support on the ground, you're going to do stuff for people. It just makes sense. So yeah, I think that you do see a lot of local investment in communities. And like Tan just tells us, as much for the tetrarchy and on the deaths of persecutors. He complains about all the money, but it does suggest that there's a lot of money going into local communities for just this reason. Yeah, thank you.
Can I go to an online question now? How do we know that it was British artisans that rebuilt homes?
Well, in this case, I'm not guessing from the material culture. In one of the orations to Constantius, the orator actually says that workmen from Britain came into the city of Autun and helped to recreate the fabric. So they are named as such.
There you go. Yeah.
This is more of a broad methodological question, but what led you to connect all of the stuff that like Padilla and Hartman are doing with the subjunctive to your particular area in late antiquity? How did you bring those two together in the first place?
This is the great thing about teaching. So a couple of years ago, every year or two, I do a graduate seminar on Roman historiography. It's the standard. And the syllabus is actually fairly easy because I pick the 10 books that I most want to read. And in 2015, it was Amy Richland. And my graduate students and I just were so excited by that book because, when I was trained, I hate to say this, but there were basically three paradigms in Roman history. You had your Gramscians, which was still very active when I was in graduate school. You had your Marxists, and you had your sort of Foucauldians, and none of these perspectives really helped get us off the page in any important way. And so Richland, those heuristics at the beginning of that book really did that. And then over the past few years, we've all wanted to understand better the connections between Roman enslavement and still contemporary U.S. attitudes about enslavement and blackness and race. And so in a graduate seminar 2 years ago, we reread Hartman, and in dialogue with Jennifer Trimble and Danielle Padilla-Peralta. And that was at the same time that I was trying to figure out, how actually do you make the relationships in the 4th century that translate into support. Constantine governed Gaul for 10 years directly. He had an antagonistic relationship with Galerius to the east, but then, and Gaul was a breakaway province, but then he left and he never went back, and never had any problem with Gaul for the rest of his reign. So what did he do? And all of these things kind of bubbling around in my head at the same time resulted in the chapter.
And it's of course interesting when you bring Padilla-Peralta, because his divine institutions is also in some ways an attempt at the subjunctive through numbers and logistics and temple building and so on and so forth. So it fits very well with this model.
Emily?
Thank you very much for that talk. I concur with what you said about mental health. It was so clear. It was so well crafted and so exciting to hear what you have managed to do so much with so little. I'm intrigued about some of the language you're using to talk about the methodology. Subjunctive, you towards the end use the word imagination. And as I was listening to you talk, the word that came to mind for me again and again was, well, this is so reasonable. This is so rational. Everything just seems to make sense. It's so watertight. And so that made me think, well, there have to be places to leak. And
Yes.
I'm imagining, I'm trying to imagine how you anticipated those counter arguments and what you were envisioning as you were crafting this. Who would your critics be? How would they come at you in maybe some particular elements of your argument? But yeah, I wondered if you could talk about how that has shaped your methodology more generally in this particular argument, and whether the word sort of, I don't know whether logic is the right word or reason, but if you think that that's a useful term to use to describe what you're doing, because I found it so compelling and interesting. That was the term I kept finding myself using as I was thinking, this really makes sense.
Why, thank you, thank you. You know, I'm a student of Hal Drake's, and he's a Constantinian scholar, of course, a Eusebian scholar. And from the time I was a graduate student, Drake's great antagonist was Tim Barnes. And Tim Barnes is probably the Rockian historian par excellence. So in my early work, I always felt like I had Barnes looking over my shoulder. And that didn't mean that I wrote things that were, that he agreed with. But it did mean that I tried to anticipate his objections and to parry them. And so I do think that scholars of that particular bent are not going to accept this kind of scholarship, and that may, you know, have been some of the anxiety from your work as well. You know, on the other hand, you know, I think that the great insight I had was to realize that Ronkian historians also use their imagination in that they imagine that all they have is the page. So that's really freeing, and I think that, you know, at a certain point in one's career, you can be more audacious and you can care less about that. I think another potential point of challenge, and something I've developed a little bit more in other places, is the idea, well, how Christian was the city anyway? You know, again, our view of Gaul in the 4th century is like, Christianity. But, you know, Irenaeus of Lyon is a huge figure in Christian theology. He was well known to Eusebius. I mean, that may be idiosyncratic, but at the very least, he's evidence for a very early Christian community in Lyon. We know there are Greek speakers in Autun. You don't want to, you know, map one totally on the other, but certainly in terms of language, people could understand each other. Plus the fact that the Bishop Reticulus is a named entity. We know that he went to the council about the Donatists called in Rome, and then he went to Arles in 314. It's super unlikely that a brand new Christian community in a city would have a bishop that the emperor would trust enough to send on these in these sorts of meetings. So I think just the very presence of a named bishop suggests that the Christian community there is of some long standing. Plus the Passio of Saint Symphorian is, I think, a 5th or early 6th century text, and so it's connected fairly closely to the period. There's been this anomalous, people have thought Lactantius was anomalous when he talks about the persecution of Aurelian. Where did that come from? And yet the Passio of Symphorian puts him under Aurelian as being martyred. And you know, maybe that's some sort of hint that there was this community there. So those are the 2 prongs on which I've tried to be most careful. But yeah, thank you for that. That makes me feel better.
Forgive me if I'm misremembering it, but how long was it between when the church was burned down by non-Christians? And how long was it between when that happened, when Constantine sent money to refurbish it? Because I'm just wondering if there was any conflict or resistance from local non-Christian leaders to having Constantine come in and boost up the Christian presence.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. So there are a couple of important chronological points. First of all, I think for a long time we assumed that Christianity wasn't legal until after the Great Persecution, and yet this is not what Eusebius tells us. It's become more accepted that in 260 under Gallienus, Christianity became a legal association. And in fact, Eusebius corroborates this in his ecclesiastical history by talking about how Christians have become, they serve in city councils, the church buildings have become more ostentatious, and then you have the persecution. So although he's talking about probably the area of Palestine, legally, it wouldn't have been any different, probably. So you have people living side by side, regardless of religious belief in the 3rd century. It is an imperial edict in 303 that impels Constantius's probably troops to pull down the church in some way, and the evidence that he did so comes from Lactantius. He doesn't say specifically Autun, but he does say that Constantius pulled down churches. That would have been 303, 304, and then the monies that go into the church would have been in 310. So it's not necessarily a local. It wasn't necessarily locals who were involved in making the persecution manifest in Autun. And this is, I think, different from the situation in the East later on. Maximin Daia actually encourages people to think on each other and to generate kind of local hostility against Christians. So that's a different situation. I don't imagine that everybody liked everyone or everyone got along, but we just don't have any evidence one side or the other.
So I mean, I think part of your argument is really helpful in trying to imagine both transitions and ways of creating a certain convivence. I think that the moment you have the money that you spend in the market to build things, you create an economy around something.
Yeah.
And that economy is attractive to a much wider stratum of population than the Christians.
Yes, that's right.
Because you cannot guarantee that a Christian person will be making your tiles. Maybe the pagan is making your tiles.
Yeah.
And at that moment, you create a process of habituation, I guess,
Right.
with that activity and with religion and with interaction and with sociability. And that is interesting.
Yeah, and it generates a certain amount of goodwill. And you could also, we have to always remember the sort of patron-client aspect of the Roman economy. We do similar things, we just don't use those terms. But if the bishop is paying you, you might show up in church, regardless of what you thought about what he was saying, right? So, that is a really attractive part of this argument to me, is that it sort of helps us understand how those relationships change over time.
Ethan?
And just sort of in response to all of this, I was also kind of thinking when the ability to rebuild a church, to maintain a church, to build new churches is withdrawn. What are the implications for networks and for the so we think of this as being something that's sort of symbolic and about sort of symbolism and sort of abstraction, but there might be this might disrupt networks. I mean, I'm thinking of sort of the 7th century Middle East or any number of other
No, that's a really good point.
And vice versa with pagan temples
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, it's sobering that, I mean, the evidence is terrible, but that I couldn't find a breath of a hint about any kind of pagan temple. In fact, one of the orators begs Constantine to come to Autun, and there he will see the beautiful temple of Apollo. There's no evidence that was in any way improved in the 4th century. So, you know, and we know that when Constantine went east, took stuff from temples, and that wasn't unusual, but I'm not sure he, you know, figured it out.
Yeah.
So the shift of, there's only, you know, finite amount of resources.
I'm just thinking about how Constantine took advantage of the situation of economic decline, and that was the perfect opportunity for him to come in and say, you know, let me be a savior and rebuild and, you know, tax exemptions. I'm just thinking, how much was this replicated elsewhere, or maybe if we see where there isn't such a degree of economic decline, like, would they be able to achieve this sort of, same sort of relationship?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the challenge of this kind of work. When I started this, I very naively thought, okay, I'll do Autun, and then I'll go on to some other cities. And I mean, you just can't, because all the archaeology in France is so local, and there's nobody is sort of put together. This is the economic situation in Gaul, or this is, and Africa, you know, is, I mean, every region is fraught for different reasons. And so I don't have that kind of bird's eye view that I would like to have. What I can say is that in Gaul, at least, the places that I know had Christian populations are Autun, Vienne, Lyon, Metz, all continue to be, you know, vital communities through the early Middle Ages and beyond. So, you know, it's not nothing. It's not what we would want, but it's not nothing. Yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned during this like economic decline how a lot of slaves were freed. What would have happened to those people like after they were freed?
Well, there's a good question. So, I mean, there are a couple of things going on. We've known for a long time. I mean, Jones talks about, you know, the colonist system, right? So you don't have as much enslavement, but you have people tied to the land. And I think that is somehow implicated in this transition. We do know that in Gaul, you have this roving band of people called the Baccaudi, and for a long time we wondered, who are they? Well, if you sit down and you look at what's happened, the system of enslavement only makes sense if you're getting work from people that is equal to or more than it costs to feed and house them. And if they are becoming a drain on your own resources, you're gonna let them go. It's a brutal system. I mean, maybe some people tried to take care of their dependents, but I suspect that many people did not. And so you have really bands of desperate people. And what else would these people do but try to make, you know, try to fend for themselves by taking food and maybe taking out some of their income in the local community, right? So it's and I think one of the things that this analysis does, and I will try and deal with in the next draft, is I think that's part of the human story that needs to be stuck down in because there are these experiences that are just terrible, and I haven't seen anything that allows me to think that those people were helped in any material way. Thank you. Yeah, good question.
I had a question. if I may.
Yeah.
At the beginning of your paper, you talked about the ability of people to switch from viticulture or barrel making or tile making to subsistence farming, and you had no confidence. In fact, you don't think that they could do that easily. My sense of knowing my cousins who are raised in more rural environments is that such people are extremely resourceful. And viticulture is not a full-time job. There are
No, that's
times
true,
of the
that's
year when you're busy doing that, and there are other times of the year when presumably you would be doing more subsistence
Yeah, you might
farming,
be.
having your
Yeah.
little garden
Yeah,
plot.
you might.
And so if you're facing a situation where you need to do more
Yeah.
subsistence farming, then scale it up a bit,
Yeah.
and you could be okay.
Yeah, people have raised this with me before. And yes, you're absolutely right that if you're probably the growers are better able to do this and may be tending plots when they're not dealing with the vines. And there may be, well, people in the cities, and we know that people grew things in the cities and plots and stuff. Nevertheless, I think that for one thing, the population that hasn't been, the urban population, factory people, they're not going to be able to grow enough to feed themselves. I think that is a given. On the farms, you know, I still think that you have a more or less specialized labor and maybe some of them are successful, but you know, growing enough food to support yourself and your family throughout the year and into the winter is something that maybe not everybody could do. I'm going to just assert that. I don't know, have you ever tried to garden?
I do garden.
Could you live off your garden? Could your family live off your garden?
I think according to some books that I have read, it could be possible if I devoted enough time to it.
Yeah. Maybe I'm just a terrible gardener.
So this is such an interesting conversation because, and I'm gonna cite with trepidation Hanson's book on agriculture, not the hoplites and the Western way of war and all that stuff, but on agriculture and on Athens as an agricultural kind of culture. And I think that there you get this sense that it's really tough work to make a living out of it. And this is what actually, I mean, you're a good hoplite because this is so bloody hard to do on the field. And to me, this has always felt somewhat convincing. And if you add to that the fact that the farm does not exist in the middle of nowhere, it has to interact with others. It has to have some sort of exchange. It's never completely autonomous. It needs to buy and sell or barter. Then suddenly the logistics become way more complicated if you have not done it before.
And thanks for reminding me of that resource. I think though, to sort of be less flip and go back through my reasoning, my assumption was that on these villas, they're growing grapes and they're probably getting other foodstuffs from the market. And when that supply dries up, then they have to devote more of their own land to growing the things that they were buying from others. And that requires having the land, and it requires also having the stuff, the seeds, the plants to put in it, and the good luck to be able to grow them well. So, and then the other thing that that's also at play here is the content of the diet, right? So you have animal husbandry is also involved, and so there are a lot of factors, and I think that I may have overcompensated, but I think that a modernist assumption is that, oh, you could just grow things. And that's not what I'm saying that you said, but I think that we need to appreciate that it might not have been so easy to switch, especially if you're, in a monoculture situation.
Which reminds us, of course, how connected the Roman world was for transfer of foodstuffs, longer distance,
Yeah.
and how reliant some segments might have been to that. And how do you have started crop in the middle of a catastrophic period to begin planting something else?
Yeah,
so,
right.
And in a world with no widely available almanacs, no seed catalogs, no,
No internet.
no internet, where
where's my columella?
where exactly, like where, and where agricultural implements are expensive. I don't know.
I imagine there must have been some kind of oral base of knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
But when you pair that with all of the plagues and people leaving and political conflict that you're describing, that would have probably made it even harder. I bet you people with specific knowledge would have left.
Yeah.
On a similar note, like, do we see kind of like collectives forming after, like, say, a bunch of farmers who have these vineyards and stuff, kind of getting together and be like, okay, we're gonna pull all our stuff, figure out how to farm, and make it through the winter.
I wish.
Where they all like, fend for yourselves, I'm doing my own potatoes or something, right?
Yeah, I guess the only evidence is terrible. What we do know is that as I said earlier, the big villas tend to have continuous habitation and stay in business, and the smaller ones tend to disappear. So that suggests not so much the association model, but
Too bad.
Yeah, too bad.
Sorry to go in a different angle here. I'm just thinking of not just like in terms of economic decline, but you also talked about less people to fill civic positions. I'm also thinking of like legal breakdown.
Yeah.
Even in terms of slaves, there's a very specific legal process of manumission and for slaves to become free men and women. So that there's a breakdown. And I was just thinking when Constantine comes back in and we have this restoration of the lawful order, I'm wondering, do we have like any sort of legal evidence there, or?
Not for the immediate period. In the Theodosian Code, there are only a handful of edicts that come from this region in that period, actually the teens. And I think, if I remember correctly, they have to do with veterans. But you do see in the 4th century, in the Codex, you do see more of a legal effort to keep people in their positions, right? And the law tends to be sort of reactive in general. So, if you're the son of the decurion, you have to become a decurion. If you're a colonist, you have to be a colonist. And it may be, this is something I think that speaks to this. At least in my head, it seems that those laws make sense in this context, trying to keep people in place. After pandemic, there's also some opportunities to move, as we also know. So that would be the evidence that I think is most pertinent.
Well, I think this has been a wonderful discussion, and thanks to you and to the students, especially, who've been asking some terrific questions. I'm
Absolutely.
really appreciative of that. Let me just, there's a note here I'm to share with people online and to all of you too. Our final seminar of the spring term will take place on Friday, April 29th. That's some time off. And feature Dr. Hellenic, a senior lecturer at the University of St. Andrews, hosted in partnership with UCLA's Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of the Hellenic Culture. The talk will discuss Constantinople, Titlan, and the trauma of the conquest. Registration for this event will open in the coming weeks. On Sunday, April 3rd, the center will also present Makrianis Unplugged, a theatrical performance adapted and directed and performed by Yorgos Paraminos. Tickets you found on our website. You can also send an email to hscom with 2 M's at sfu.ca. Thanks, everybody, and there'll be pizza and potables to follow after your craft. So please join us.